Hello everyone, here in this practice we are going to learn how to define not null and check constraints during creating a table. As we learned before, table constraints enforce rules on the data in a table when a row is inserted, updated or deleted. The constraint must be satisfied for the operation to succeed. So here we have two practices. Create a table called student with 4 columns. So let's create the table, create table student. The columns definition, as we can see here, student ID number. Let's put it in a new line, and we have here a full name varchar 250. We can just copy it and put it here, and we have email varchar 2 here also, and the last column, which is registered hours, which is number of 4, and then close the brace. But here we want to use default option for the email, so we can put here default, and this is the default value, which is test@test.com. so in case you insert a record into the student table and you don't specify a value for the email, he will use test@test.com instead of using a null value. And we want to specify here define student ID full name columns as not null. So we want to define constraints here, not null for the student ID and not null here also for the full name. And the last thing here, we want to define a constraint registered hours must be greater than 0. So we can specify here comma and then define the constraint keyword, name of the constraint, for example registered hours chk stands for check, and then type of the constraint, which is check constraint, and then open brace and specify on which column you want to define the check constraint, which is in our case registered hours greater than 0, close the brace. Once finished, run the create statement. So as we can see, table student created. We can confirm the structure of the table by using describe command and run this statement. As we can see here, the table contains 4 columns: student ID not null, full name not null, email, and the last column, which is registered hours. Describe command cannot be used to view all constraints defined on a table. It can be used only to view not null constraints, as we can see. If you want to view all constraints created on the table, we can use either SQL Developer or we can use Oracle Data Dictionary views that will be discussed later on in later chapters. We can go to the table students, click on this table students, and here we can go to constraints column, and as we can see here, we have 3 constraints created on the student table. We have here full name is not null, student is not null, and registered hours greater than 0. As we can see here, the constraint type is check for all 3 constraints because not null is considered as a check constraint. So here we have check constraint, full name is not null, check constraint, student ID is not null, and the last one, which is check constraint, registered hours greater than 0. Let us go back to the practice. After creating a table, test the constraint by inserting sample records. So let's try to insert records into the table. Insert into student values. For example, let's try to put here null for the student ID. Here, for example, tom@test.com, and registered hours, for example, 10. Let's try to run this insert statement. As we can see, it failed. Cannot insert null into student ID. Let's try to put here 1 and in the name here, for example, null. Run the insert statement again. As we can see, cannot insert null into full name. Let's try to put here, for example, Tom, and let's put here instead of 10, for example, -1. As we can see, check constraint, and this is the name of the constraint, violated because the registered hour column's value must be greater than 0. So we can put here, for example, 10. Let's try to run this insert statement again, and now 1 row inserted. So as we can see, the constraints defined on the table enforce rules on the data in a table when a row is inserted, updated, or deleted. The constraint must be evaluated to true for the operation to succeed. Let us try to insert another record, and here we want to specify a value for the student ID, for the full underscore name, for the registered hours only. We don't want to specify here the email. So if you don't put a value here for the email, for example, if we put here Sam, the student ID is 2 and number of hours registered, for example 20, and try to insert the record, as we can see one row inserted. In this case, instead of using null value for the email, it will use in this case test@this.com. Try to select from the table to confirm the values. So as we can see, one Tom at test.com, this is the first record we inserted, and this is the second record we inserted. It used test@test.com, which is the default value, instead of putting a null value here. So in this practice, we learn how to define not null and check constraints during creating a table. I hope this video was informative for you, and thank you for watching.